Okay, so the theme of Northern Ireland is one which reflects in a particular sharp way many of the issues we've been discussing this week. One of them is the theory of Clausewitz, the theory that says that war is a continuation of policy by other means. The next one is our attitude towards imperialism, and in this case, British imperialism. And I'm directing this towards the British left and the British working class movement, and its attitude towards its own state when it's involved in a war. It also looks at the question that we have discussed already in the presentation that Kevin gave yesterday, and where we talked about the Marx turn, but in any event, the argument that a nation that oppresses another will never be free. And it shows those questions in a different light, but in one that's far closer to home. So, okay, I'm going to just give a few background details before I get on to the discussion about the war in Ireland that took place between 1968 and ended in a ceasefire 1994/1998. 25 years or so of an intensely militarized situation. Let there be no doubt about it, but this was a war zone. I went there myself with my friend when we were about 20, I think it was like 1980, 1981, in what it must have been the daftest trip ever. We had our rucksacks on our back and our two-man tents, and we went around Ireland, and we went across the border, arriving in Derry in the back of some Donegal farmer's car. We went into a pub and we spoke to some people and asked them where we could put our tent up in Derry. Luckily, they were Republicans, and luckily they advised us get the hell out of here, because this was not a safe place for two young women with a two-man tent pitching up in some zone in Northern Ireland. But I remember we did get a lift from the truck driver, and he drove through. He was going to Belfast, so he went across and down, and seeing the landscape, and particularly the painted walls, the painted side pavements, you could see that this was such a divided country, stateless. And also the soldiers on the streets, this was like a massive military operation. It was intensely militarized. As I say, we were lucky, but many others were not. And people who lived in Northern Ireland knew the score and knew where to go and what to say and what to do, but obviously anybody from the outside didn't. Okay, so and now I just want to move on to take a little bit of a journey down memory lane for comrades who were involved in the Leninists. In the 1980s, it was set up in 1981. And what I did was I spent some time looking back over the journal from around 1986 to look at the arguments that we were facing and what we were doing. I myself joined, I think, in around 1988, 1989, and I remember being completely astounded that here I was in England and all of these people were supporting Irish liberation. Not all these people in the Leninists. And I thought, well, in a way I found it like a little bit, strange. But then also I think, I was very happy because it seemed like this was something that, was really absent in my other experiences at work, where people would say to you, why are you Irish always fighting? You're just a mad lad over there. Why are you always fighting and then coming over here looking for jobs from us? Why are you always getting drunk and singing Irish songs and fighting on the streets? It was really, there was a strong level of prejudice and also such confusion in the minds of people in Britain and the working class about what was really going on. Of course, this was a deliberate policy by the British government, and subsequently I studied the Glasgow Media Group, which did a study on the media throughout maybe the 70s and 80s, and showed how exactly words were being used for the IRA, which were terrorists, words used for the loyalists, paramilitaries, which were like freedom fighter or something, definitely something much more much less threatening, and how the whole media strategy was very intricately worked out, and deliberately so, in order to continue with this idea that the whole thing was a mess. I mean, we get something similar in Palestine today, don't we, where people say, oh, I don't know what's going on. It disarms you intellectually. Anyway, so in 1986, in the Leninists, I come across an argument of the Morning Star, which I think at the time was still the paper of the leadership of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And the Leninists was a faction which had been set up in 1981 to fight for the reforging of the party on a revolutionary basis. In that criticism, the Comrades not only criticised the leadership of the CPGB for its refusal to support the struggle, but also for its equation of Republican violence and loyalist violence. And this was something that was very prevalent on the left. Also militant, which the organisation which went on to form the Socialist Party. And I'm sure there are plenty of others who did the same thing. So it was presented as something which was fundamentally about the inability of the Protestants and the Catholics to get on, and their attacks and counterattacks on each other. I came across another Leninist where there was a very strong criticism, and quite rightly so, of a group in the CPGB called Straight Left, strange name, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day, which refused to support the campaign of the Guilford Four. Now, lots of comrades here won't know about the Guilford Four, but the Guilford Four were a group of people who were framed for murders that they never committed. They were locked in prison for decades, and then when they were finally released, you know, as broken people, the likes of the Morning Star and the militant were all there cheering, victory, victory, victory. But at the time, the Straight Left and many more were refusing. Oh, we don't know enough about this, it could be dangerous. What they were worried about was losing their friends in the trade union movement, and the Labour Party the Labour left, who basically was very, very dubious about coming out in support even of these people who, the evidence of, what's his name, Chris Mullen, well, that was the Birmingham Six, and some people who actually, in the legal profession and politicians, who were honest individuals who went out and did the research and showed that these people had been framed. Even in those circumstances, people were refusing to support them just in case, because they didn't know enough about it, because they trusted perhaps what was being said on the British media, or more likely because they did not want to take on their own state. There were also, in the articles, complaints, it was also set out the fact that the Communist Party leadership and the CPB and others used to complain that the armed struggle was causing problems in winning over the British working class to support Irish self-determination. I remember this even in the 1990s, where the SWP would complain about bombs going off, saying that how are you ever going to get anybody to support the Irish struggle if they keep setting off bombs? Of course, that was missing the point. The fact is that they needed to take that side of the Irish struggle before they could make any such demands. They needed to show fundamentally that they were on the side of the Republican movement, which was, with all its faults, fighting a genuine democratic struggle for self-determination, one which, as I've already mentioned, has been going on for hundreds of years and was just in its latest guide. They also I mean, I know Alliance for Workers' Liberty did this, but I also understand that the Communist Campaign Group once organised a tour with a man called Gusty Spence, who was a member of the PUP, which is the I don't know what the actual name is for the Progressive Unionist Party, of course. And anyway, so he was basically a loyalist who hated Catholics and loyalists, the loyalists in the north, the loyalist gangs. And that was generally, you know, because their aim was to prop up the British state in Northern Ireland. They did take out a lot of their anger, frustration with the situation on Catholics. Anyway, they included him on the platform, as though there was no difference between the two. You know, as though the IRA and the Sinn Féin were exactly the same, just all different sides of the same struggle. Well, this is not the case. In Northern Ireland, you had on the one hand the nationalist population, some and not all of them supported Sinn Féin and the IRA. And you had the IRA, and then you had the British government and the loyalists. So, you know, they were the two sides, and they refused to take sides. And not only did they refuse to take sides, but they, to me, they connived in the modelling up of the politics and trying to take this kind of middle ground. Okay. And we said in the paper at the time, in many articles, many of them written by Alan Merrick and Jack Conrad and Mark Fisher, that if it was a struggle in South Africa or in Palestine, then there was no problem. You know, troops out of, or you know, I'm trying to think of the right analogy, but the troops out of Vietnam, the American troops out of Vietnam on the skids of the helicopters would have been the kind of sort of approach that they'd taken, but not Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, there seemed to be this kind of idea that the British troops were there to control the warring tribes and that the Irish were incapable of ruling themselves. From the point of view of the British government, of course, this makes sense because they did not want any major social change in Ireland, and they worried, particularly because even up to the late 1990s, there was an element of the Republican struggle which connected with socialism and with Marxism. I mean, indeed, the Leninists had very strong connections with the Republican prisoners in the Maze and the H blocks, and sent many papers to them. And it's been a really enjoyable experience to go through the papers and see the amount of correspondence we were getting, and the fact that we were alone really on the British left in reflecting that struggle and showing that these were not mad gunmen, you know, but that these were people who wanted social change, some of them being confused about their ideas, some of them being like green socialists, or others like the Irish Republican Socialist Party being much better. And again, the Leninists did a lot of work into that and into trying to develop these comrades. And so that it wasn't like we just support the IRA, it was to try and help them to the socialist forces that were there to develop and provide another program for the people, the working class of Ireland. In 1988, on June the 30th, the Time to Go campaign was launched. And I definitely remember this, and I definitely remember being on this demonstration because we had a workers' theatre movement, Agitprop, and we did Agitprop theatre about, you know, visual manifestation of the situation of Northern Ireland, the imprisonment of the Catholic population in this sectarian statelet. Involved in the Time to Go was Tariq Ali, who I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, somebody who's very well known as a Trotskyist. I don't know whether he calls himself a Trotskyist anymore, but somebody who would have been at the forefront of criticisms of imperialism internationally. Paul Foot, who's now dead, a leader of the Socialist Worker Party, or a leading member of the Socialist Worker Party. In fact, I believe the Socialist Worker Party were also involved in the Time to Go. Whether they did much to build the demonstrations, I don't know. The Communist Party of Great Britain, the leadership of the party, this Communist Party of Britain, the Labour left. What this campaign did was it tried to kind of approach British government, I think, on a, come on, be reasonable about this. People don't want you there. They appealed to war weariness. Again, I'm taking from the articles in the paper, to polls at the time that were carried out among the British public. They showed people were just sick of the war. Of course they were. But the way that they approached the question was to say that there needed to be, well, I think there were different voices, but the most overwhelming one was that there needed to be a phased withdrawal. Again, there were some, I believe Claire Short is probably one of the most well-known of them. She was a Labour Party MP, I don't think she is anymore, is she? Anyway, that had this argument that there would be a bloodbath. If British troops left Ireland, there would be a bloodbath. Obviously, not recognising the fact that the war that was going on was killing people, and the institution behind the war was the one responsible for it in any event. I see that in the Leninists, every time there was an atrocity, which would have been Ulma, many attacks like things, I still believe that the IRA in general tries to target British state targets, I should say, thought and went against British state targets, but then things did go wrong and there were some atrocities. There is no doubt about that. But the argument of comrades in the Leninists was that we will defend the IRA because they're fighting against our own state, and until such time as we have shown in Britain that we have built a solidarity movement worth its salt, only then can we say to them, comrades, you should not do this, or you should, once we're in that situation. But we weren't in that situation, and over the years, the Republican movement in the form of the IRA naturally became more and more isolated from the working class in the north of Ireland, because of course people, their family, they were in internment, we had the hunger strikes, people were suffering greatly, and the politics of the IRA wasn't, although there were members in there, and particularly in the IRSP, who considered themselves socialists, it was really a petty bourgeois nationalist movement with a highly democratic potential, but its politics, as we can see today, were not for a socialist revolution or socialist society. Do you remember as well how in 1998 we had a ban on Sinn Féin in the media? We had a similar one in Ireland, and what it was, I mean, it really does sound ridiculous today, was that the voices of members of the Republican movement could not be heard. So what they did, the media were really against it, and to be fair to them, they got around it very effectively by using the voice of actors. So for years, Gerry Adams had a lot, quite a nice, Stephen Rea was the one who voiced him. Everybody wanted to know what he sounded like, but you could hear his words through the voice of an actor. Now it sounds ridiculous, but it was the same in the South. They did exactly the same thing. But the argument from the British state was that they wanted to deny them the oxygen of publicity. So, you think about that today, though, more seriously, and you think how often that's said about voices that are, like people who are arguing positions which are inconvenient for the state, even among the left. Well, we don't want to give them the oxygen of publicity. I've heard it so many times. In 1988, the Leninists set up Hands Off Ireland to campaign for principled anti-imperialist withdrawal. But by then it seems to me, like looking that the movement in Britain, such as it was, had already started to get smaller, marches were smaller, And although I think there were probably about 6 marches a year, they were all gradually dwindling as the movement kind of ran out of steam in some ways. So we also demanded whenever there would be political prisoners released, and I think that this was more the late 1980s, early 1990s, that finally cases would get before the British Court of Appeal or Court of Lords, and finally they'd say, well, yes, there wasn't any Semtex on his hands. Yes, okay. It does seem that there were some signs of bruising on the prisoner when he was held. You know, basically admitting, actually, yes, it's true, Irish people were being framed, were being tortured, were being made to sign forced confessions, were being intimidated, and that these people had never been innocent, had never done these things, and that in fact it seemed that really this had been known for quite some time, but they didn't want to release them because they didn't want to show that they had actually stitched them up. But the demand of the Leninists was that there should be all political prisoners should be released, that there shouldn't be this kind of idea of innocent and guilty, that this was a legitimate war, a legitimate struggle, and that the kind of tactics that should be introduced into it in terms of the workers' movement were similar to those with the Dunn store strikers. Again, comrades from young people from overseas won't know about this, but in 1985 or 6, the Dunn store strikers refused to handle South African goods, and it was an industrial action, and it was successful, particularly in bringing the question to public attention, and it showed how workers could get involved in the struggle on their own terms. And I think there was a picture of a factory producing plastic bullets at the time. So the aim was that, I mean, obviously a small organization, a small campaign wasn't going to be able to do it, but the aim was taking exemplary action and showing that the working class in Britain could take action to show their solidarity with the struggle in Ireland, and to show in particular that they wanted no hand, act, or part of in the domination of Ireland by their state. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to skip over some other things that the Leninist and the CPGB did. Okay, so by 1994, the situation had reached a stage where the IRA decided that it would need to start to enter into peace talks. Now, I think that they may in fact have really started in the 1980s, but by 1990s, it was clear that they were locked in a situation where they were not going to be able to win. Now, the talks which began at that stage and ended in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement are ones which there were some concessions made by the British state. I mean, there were some concessions made in relation to the Northern Ireland Assembly and how it operates. But there was an important defeat in terms of the question of sovereignty. The Irish government, which was involved, which was one of the signatories to the agreement, it undertook to hold a referendum to renounce all constitutional claims to Northern Ireland. And the British government said that it would amend its own legislation so that in the event that the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland sees that there's a situation where the majority of people, if asked, would want to be part of the United Ireland, can then hold, I don't even think it says referendum, some kind of a ballot on the question. So this is to me, it's a very provisional, very unclear commitment by Britain at the time. So really, I think you can say the armed struggle was defeated, but not without conditions on it. There were some advances made in terms of how the assembly works, but even there, I think it's still what you would say problematic. Okay, but the referendum was passed overwhelmingly. In the South, there was only a 56% turnout for it, with almost 95% in favour. So it was presented, if we sign this, then it's going to end the war and create a possibility of a united Ireland in the future. That's how the Southern government presented it to the population, Fianna Fáil, led by Bertie Ahern. And in the North, I think that there was 71% turnout and 81% for it. And again, that would have been presented very differently. It would have been presented as a way to make sure that the Unionist veto would continue to dominate and there would be no chance of an Irish United Ireland coming into force. Okay, so okay, that's all of that. Okay, in 1997, was it 1997 was the referendum? No, 1998 was the referendum. And there's an article in the Weekly Worker by Jack Conrad saying that there is nothing democratic about this referendum and that basically it's a way of copper fastening British rule in Northern Ireland, particularly because of the concession on sovereignty, and that the interesting point, I think, was about how the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland would decide, would it be because of the demographics, you know, whether there was a majority, would it be because of demographics, or whether it would be because of the number of elected representatives, or would it be because of a poll that's taken? But it was all like left up in the air. And then anyway, that to vote for the Good Friday Agreement was a de facto acceptance of the stateless. It's basically of solidifying and making legal British continued presence in Ireland. But other left groups took a different position, and the Socialist Party in Ireland and the Socialist Party of Britain at the time, it said afterwards that they didn't support the Good Friday Agreement, but they called for a yes vote, although they didn't support it, because if there wasn't a yes vote, then everything would become much more dangerous, and in other words, there would be a bloodbath. They also said that a yes vote provided a window of opportunity for progressive coming together of the working class in the north of Ireland and in Ireland as a whole. Now other comrades can tell me about what other organisations did, because you were there and you know yourself how it was. But in general, Socialist Worker Party too, they all supported this as a step forward. They didn't support it, but they called for a vote for it. What else, you know, does that mean? So since we've had the Good Friday Agreement since 1998, what has happened? Well, really, the situation in some respects has changed. We know that the Democratic Unionist Party and unionism in general in the north of Ireland isn't doing as well as it had been previously. We know that there have been demographic changes. The census in 2011 was, I think, 45% Catholic and 48% Protestant, and that was a fall for the Protestants and a rise for the Catholic. And the next census figures, I couldn't locate them, perhaps somebody else knows, are expected to show a Catholic majority for the first time. But in terms of the operation of the Good Friday Agreement, what it actually has done and I hate to keep repeating this point, but it has actually concretized divisions. And how the assembly operates. It's some system that was devised by constitutional experts to maintain stability, but not democracy. You have to designate yourself as Republican, nationalist, Protestant, or other. And the other are anybody like the People for Profit Alliance or other, the Alliance Party or other, and anybody who challenges the status quo really is marginalized. So it's very hard to get a voice. And it kind of ends up with nothing really changing, because although, I mean, there have been changes with the elections, I think that it at least aims to keep things as they are and to control the situation. It's very undemocratic. And also among the working class themselves, the peace walls, which were erected largely by Protestants, by loyalists, in order to protect themselves from the being swamped by Catholics, they have remained in place. And indeed, we've seen last year how there were like border fights at a couple of these. So they basically, if there's been any changes in terms of the dialogue between the working class people of Northern Ireland, it's been despite the Good Friday Agreement rather than because of it. It did not provide a space. It provided stability for the British government. Now, it hasn't been stable, you could say, because of the fact that, you know, it's always in crisis, and it's not sitting at the moment because of Brexit and because of the rebellion of the DUP, which refuses to sit until it gets its own way on the protocol. But it has managed to stabilize it because it's meant that the IRA have got rid of their arms. They've now transformed into a constitutional party, and they have dealt with, by and large, any dissident groups who are going to present a challenge to the status quo. So now Sinn Féin are following a path that was already tread by Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin, which transformed itself into Fianna Fáil in the early 1920s. They too were fighting an armed war against British imperialism. They too took the constitutional pathway, and they are now in power. And Sinn Féin wants to be in power in the south and has a good chance of being in power at the next election, at least on a coalition basis. So just a small point, because I wasn't going to go into it, maybe it'll come up in the discussion, but like into that context, you put the border poll and you think, well, the border poll, which I've already described as something that the Northern Ireland, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland can call blah, 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 means that there will be a referendum in the south and a referendum in the north if he's being state. What we have in Ireland now is the majority of the left calling for a border poll as something which will create a situation where working class forces can come onto the agenda, etc., etc., etc. I mean, I'm saying to you, we've heard it all before. It hasn't happened. It is not going to happen. As far as I'm concerned, the British government continues to have a vested interest in staying in Northern Ireland, because I think that it remains worried about the possibility of social change coming through a united Ireland. Now, obviously, there are many other factors today than were at play in the 1960s. We have Scotland, etc., etc. But even if they did agree, even if they did go, okay, we've got the polls in place, we'll go down that road, do you think that it's one where using that mechanism, the working class is going to be able to put its own stamp on politics? Of course not. It will be a very lengthy process. There will be all sorts of checks and balances put into place to make sure that this doesn't lead to any kind of working class or socialist challenge to British government. In any event, I think, as I've shown, that that those kind of mechanisms are not neutral. Like what we were arguing in the 1980s was that Britain was not a neutral force in Northern Ireland, and it remains the case today. The fact that there's peace now, as opposed to armed war, does not change the situation. You can see clearly that we've got a policy of domination, of continued domination, a belief that Northern Ireland is part of the British state, and a refusal to disengage except on its own terms. So this is a policy which has led to armed war, and now we've got peace war, if you know what I mean. So the last point I wanted to make is about the Marx quote, what, a nation that oppresses another can never be free. I think it's been acknowledged by some of the more intelligent or open bourgeois writers that basically the key in Ireland is British rule, and the loyalty to British rule in Ireland is the litmus test. For the working class movement in Britain, the fact that it hasn't ever managed to build a real solidarity movement has led to itself suffering a number of attacks. Northern Ireland, acknowledged to be a training ground for British military forces and police. The troops, the riot police, I should say, that were developed in Northern Ireland have been used against strikes, against minor strikes, most famously, but again and again against strikes and demonstrations in Britain. The censorship, the fact that it's allowed to ban elements which are challenging the British government, the introduction of the Diplock courts in Northern Ireland, which were juryless courts, which were held without public presence, has led to, I don't know what they're called today, but the courts where they try alleged terrorists in Britain, the various terrorism acts that have been introduced, the attacks on the right to protest, the Criminal Justice Acts, which have meant the arrest and the prosecution of many protesters. But fundamentally, I think it has weakened it politically and left it in a situation where it believes, or perhaps is conflicted about the role of its own state, where it believes that its state can be a power for good, can be a power for peace, and when obviously the opposite is the case. And that, I think, reflects itself also in the fact that here we are now in another war with Ukraine, and where the British state can also be seen and is accepted by the majority of the population as something which is a benign force, all the while that it's sending troops, not troops, but weapons to Ukraine. There is no opposition to that. So there have been no opportunities provided by the various manoeuvres of the British state, and unfortunately I think the British left and the Irish left hasn't learned that. And I think it shows that in the sense that we're still being told that there are opportunities within the Good Friday Agreement. I think a much better policy was one that was actually mentioned by Jack Conrad in that piece in 1998, was of an All-Ireland Constituent Assembly to decide on the issues affecting the Ireland as a whole, rather than use or place illusions in a piece of legislation of the British government aimed to suppress self-determination. Thank you.